You can sit there. Yeah, you can sit wherever you want. That's perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lynn Goldman, and I am the Michael and Lori Milken Dean of the Milken Institute School of Public Health, a pediatrician, as well as an environmental epidemiologist. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the George Washington University and our School of Public Health building. And especially, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. I think this is really the inaugural event for our Climate and Health Institute. I see here Dr. Susan Anenberg, who is the leader of this effort and whom will be involved later. But I also see a very important person who I'd like to introduce you to, President Mark Wrighton. Mark Wrighton has been the president of George Washington University since January of this year, and he is a stellar leader in academics, a chemist, somebody who I think actually has a pretty in-depth understanding of many of these issues, as well as so many other issues around how to have a successful education and research institute like George Washington University. It's a great pleasure, President Wrighton, to have you with us today. Thank you so much for giving us your welcome.
Thanks very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to participate in this first in-person meeting of the Climate and Health Institute. Dean Goldman is a fantastic dean of the Milken Institute School of Public Health. I heard a lot about it after the public announcement that I would become president here at GW, and I have been very impressed and not disappointed one bit. This is a great school, and just in a week, we're going to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of this founding of this school. So it's great to be here with such an important subject, and we have a great keynote speaker, who I will introduce in just a moment. But I'm a chemist, as Lynn Goldman just mentioned. I recently completed a study on the role of chemistry in the U.S. economy for the National Academies. My vice chair was Kathy Tway from Industry, Johnson Matthey, and we spent a lot of time on issues that chemists could address in connection with climate change. It's somewhat ironic that a simple chemical reaction, the combustion of fossil fuels leading to the accumulation of carbon dioxide, is such a challenge for the world. And fortunately, chemists have solutions. And there are many opportunities to overcome the challenges that we face. But in the more immediate future, we're going to be facing day-to-day problems that will be exacerbated by the slow response that we have in order to overcome climate change. I regard this general challenge as the challenge of the century, and I hope that we can make more rapid progress than has been predicted. Our university is making very important commitments to overcome the challenges of climate change, and certainly our students, our faculty, and our staff are very much committed to working on this critical problem. I'm so pleased that this institute was formed about a year ago, and I'm very enthusiastic about the prospects for positive contributions. Our university has been doing a number of things already to address climate change. One of them is that we have committed to carbon neutrality by 2030. That's only about 7.25 years from now. And we're well on our way to this goal, especially through energy efficiency associated with the physical facilities of this institution. The newly renovated Thurston Hall, which is home to 820 first-year students, is our 17th LEED certified project on the GW campus. The university also purchases renewable energy from an off-site solar development that meets more than 50% of our electricity needs. And of course, electricity is vital in this hot, humid environment in the summer. A second effort is including this institute, focusing on climate change and human health. This is a source of pride and opportunity for our students, for our faculty, and for making a positive contribution locally, nationally, and internationally. Third, our institution is playing a special role in engaging civil society in highlighting areas where research and new knowledge can be used to build a more sustainable, healthful world through evidence-based policies. This event exemplifies our role, and I want to extend my congratulations to the leadership and to those faculty members who are taking part in this important initiative. As I mentioned, we have a very distinguished U.S. leader, and that is Senator Tom Carper. He came into our Milken Institute School of Public Health facilities and enthusiastically engaged with everyone. And I'm very impressed with his demeanor and enthusiasm for being here. He is the senior U.S. Senator from Delaware and the chairman of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. He's a leader in fighting the climate crisis that we now have before us. He's helped author many of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. I hope that act is effective. And he has helped to advance a healthier climate and more sustainable future for all in the world. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Senator Tom Carper. Please welcome him.
President Wrighton. Let me hear you say President Wrighton. No, come on, let me hear you say President Wrighton.
Right on.
Right on. I love that. My wife said to me, "What are you doing today?" And I said, "I'm going to be giving a big speech in Washington." She said, "Who's introducing?" I said, "The president." She said, "With the right one?" And I said, "Yes, the right one." Great to be here with you and all of you. Thanks for the warm welcome. I walked in. I love to shake hands, and I've done it for as long as I can remember. And it's great to be. Do we have any undergrads here? Do we have any undergrads here? Do we have any graduate students here? Do we have any faculty members here? Do we have any members of my staff here? No? I want the members of my staff just to stand up that are here. Just stand up and take a bow. Go ahead. Give them a nice round of applause. A lot of times, guys or gals like me get credit for the good things, and maybe the blame for things that we do. But one of the things I've always done throughout my life, I surround myself with people smarter than me. My wife says it's not hard to find them, and some of them are here today. And it's a joy and a privilege to work and serve with them. I want to just fill in a little bit of, my sister and I were born with a silver spoon in our mouth. No, actually, we were born in a coal mining town called Beckley, West Virginia. And not much money, hard work, deep faith, good values. We picked the right parents. My dad was a claims adjuster for Nationwide Insurance. I actually started off as chief petty officer in World War II, became learned how to use a GI Bill and learned how to fix wrecked cars. And and he became a claims adjuster out of that. My mom worked at the Five and Dime. And once when my sister and I were, I don't know, mid-school, like 8th, 9th grade, we're having supper. We grew up later on in Danville, Virginia, and we're having supper with my mom and dad. And my dad said at dinner, he said, your mom and I expect, my sister, your mom and I expect you to go to college. And he went on to say that they never went to college, and nobody from Shady Springs High School in Beaver, West Virginia ever went to college. They didn't. And he said, well, your mom and I expect you to go to college. And he said, and we expect you to figure out how to pay for it. Really? He said, really? And for about the next 3 or 4 years, I tried to figure out how was I going to pay to go to college. And I was lucky enough to win a Navy WOTC scholarship. I could barely spell ROTC when I got to high school, but learned how to spell ROTC, became a naval flight officer, and ended up serving, last place I want to go is to Southeast Asia, and then played 3 tours in Southeast Asia. I'm the longest, the only Vietnam veteran now serving in the U.S. Senate. Also, father of 2 Eagle Scouts, and we highly value this planet on which we grow up. My mom was a deeply religious woman and made sure we went to church a lot, and also made sure, along with our dad, that we had a real reverence for this planet on which we have been plotted down and plopped down, and that we know that we have an obligation to take care of it. President Macron he came here and spoke from France, came and spoke at our joint session of Congress a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget what he said. He spoke in English, so it was helpful. But he said, we only have one planet. I only have one planet. There's no planet B. This is the only one we got, and we got to take care of it. And I take that to heart. I just want to mention one thing about Delaware. Delaware is the first state. Before any other state ratified the Constitution, we did. For 1 whole week, Delaware was the entire United States of America. And we eventually opened it up, led in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. The rest, I think, for the most part, it's turned out okay, and at least until lately. It's still early. It's still early, so we'll see. We'll see. But one of the things about Delaware, anybody ever been to Delaware? Anybody actually been to Delaware? Not just drove through, paid the toll on I-95 bridge, actually got out and avoided paying sales taxes. We have more 5-star beaches last time I checked than any state in the country. And my state is sinking. We're the lowest lying state in America. My state is sinking, and the seas around us are rising. And for us, sea level rise, climate change are real and personal. As many of you know, for years, maybe for decades, the scientific community has pleaded with leaders across government and across industry to take action on climate before it's too late. And they've warned us that time is running out, that we must shift away from fossil fuels or face a future of unrelenting extreme weather events. Now scientists are telling us it's code red for humanity, for all of us. Climate crisis is here, and Americans from communities small and large, rich and poor, are feeling its impact almost every day. Most notably in the form of drought, heat waves, wildfires, floods. We actually got a guy here named Ian talking about hurricanes. We had a bad one, almost a number 5, and we're going to have a bunch more before we're done. The cost of extreme weather and climate change are mounting, and not just in dollars, but also in lives. Just last month, Hurricane Ian made landfall in Florida, not far from where my parents lived for many years, the last parts of their life. Came across as a 4 and almost a 5 before it was finished. We had more rain in Delaware in the last week or so. I joked about it. It's not funny, but I joked about it. Driving around the state of Delaware and seeing people build arcs. But we thought it was never going to stop raining. Communities caught up in the path of the storm experienced major flooding, property, infrastructure damage, and as I said earlier, tragic loss of life. In fact, early estimates indicate that Hurricane Ian was one of the most costly storms in the history of our country. That's saying a lot. With insured losses between some 53 and $74 billion. That's billion with a B. And the frequency of these costly events has increased in recent years. According to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Ian was the 15th billion-dollar climate disaster that we've experienced in our country. Not this century, not this decade, this year. That's 15 just this year. We know that these deadly weather events will only get worse in the years ahead without coordinated action. We also know that the most vulnerable among us, including communities of color and other marginalized communities, will suffer the most if we fail to meet this crisis head on. So the question that we need to ask ourselves, and the question we are asking ourselves in the Congress and other places across this country, is what are we going to do about it? Are we going to complain about it? Are we just going to point fingers at other people? Or are we going to do something about it? The best science available tells us that in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to achieve net zero carbon emission no later than 2050. No later than 17 years from now. Achieving this ambitious goal will not be easy, but it is possible. It is possible. As I like to say, in adversity lies opportunity. Anybody know who first famously said, in adversity lies opportunity? I'll tell you, it's Einstein. He used to say, in adversity lies opportunity. If you don't remember anything else that I say today, remember those words of Einstein. My whole life, I've looked at adversity. Coal mining town, West Virginia, we had nothing. And to be able to have a chance to go to school, thank you, Navy, thank you, taxpayers of this country. Ended up spending 3 tours to Southeast Asia, didn't want to go there. But I got to go back 15 years after that with John McCain and John Kerry to help normalize relations between the U.S. and Vietnam. I believe firmly, fervently, that in adversity lies opportunity. And the key is to not be disenchanted, not to be discouraged, but to find that opportunity and put together the team that will help to accomplish that. Thanks to, I would say, thanks to the leadership of the guy who lives in the White House these days. Somebody I've known for a while. But thanks to the hard work of scientists, thanks to the good work of a bunch of researchers, experts, student activists, and leaders of all levels of government, state, local, federal, we've finally broken through the logjam on major climate and clean energy legislation. For those of you who aren't paying attention, we finally have risen to the challenge. And is it over? Is it time to declare victory? No. But are we on the right path? We bet we are. There are 3 major climate achievements that I'm particularly proud of that had something to do with, I get to chair, as the President said, I get to chair a committee called Environment and Public Works. We have jurisdiction over roads, highways, bridges. We have jurisdiction over water infrastructure, wastewater, drinking water. We have jurisdiction over climate change, EPA, and so forth. And I lead the committee. We have 10 Democrats. We have 10 Republicans. And I lead the committee with a woman from West Virginia. I'm born in West Virginia, too. And she's my friend. Her name is Shelley Capito. And we work together. And believe it or not, most people wouldn't believe this. They think we just hate each other and find ways to make the other side look bad. That's not the way I was raised, and that's not the way she was raised either. We look for opportunities to work together. We believe that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. We disagree on some stuff, but we literally meet just about every week. When we're not in session, we'll meet on the phone. She's back in West Virginia, I'm back in Delaware, and we just talk about our agenda, what are we doing, how we're doing well, what do we want to have hearings on, and not many people do that. But you know what? When we reported out legislation dealing with infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, and all that stuff, water, wastewater, so forth, unanimously from our committee. We just finished Water Resource Development Act, and we reported out our committee unanimously. I could go down the list. Major recycling legislation a couple of months ago. It's now hopefully going to be included in another major bill, recycling it unanimously. And so people say you can't get anything. Nobody wants to work across the valley, get anything done. That's just not true. And we're living proof of that. But when we were drafting the highway portion of this legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, a year or two ago. We included in the story, not many people know this, but we included in that bipartisan infrastructure bill a major historic $18 billion climate title to reduce emissions and invest in more resilient highway infrastructure. We also invested $7.5 billion to build out the first ever national network of electric vehicle chargers in the U.S., as well as $5 billion in funding to purchase electric school buses across our nation. I like to work out 6 days a week. And 2 days a week, I go out and I run. I run outside. Sometimes I run along a road. It's a 4-lane road, has a nice shoulder. But a bunch of buses come by. It's really early. It's still dark. And they honk at me. And this one day it was raining really hard last week. And the bus driver said, "I thought you had more sense than to run in weather like this." But it was a diesel-powered bus. Most of the buses that went by me this morning when I was running are diesel-powered buses. Most of the buses in our DART system, Delaware Authority for Regional Transit, are diesel-powered. But that ain't going to be the case 5, 10, 15 years from now. We're starting to add electric vehicles. We put a lot of money in our legislation for electric vehicles and for electric buses. The greatest source of carbon emissions in our country comes from our vehicles, our roads, highways, and bridges. And so that's putting a lot of money toward that, not just for the buses themselves, but for the charging stations as well. These investments are going to significantly reduce emissions from the transportation sector. They're going to help all of us breathe a lot easier. In August, this last August, we were able to build on the bipartisan success of the infrastructure legislation by passing something called the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. And most people think, well, that's probably not much of a bill to deal with climate change or the environment. As it does out a lot of that legislation, including a lot of the tax provisions, clean technology tax provisions, have a whole lot to do with our environment and a safer planet. This historic law includes some $370 billion in climate and clean energy funding that are going to put our nation back on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Get this, by 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. By 40% below the 2005 levels in 7 years, 2030. That's what we call, I'm probably mixing metaphors, putting the pedal to the metal. There you go. But this law is critical down payment on reaching President Biden's goal of cutting emissions in half by the end of this decade and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. In the Environment and Public Works Committee's title alone, we invested more than $41 billion in climate and environmental justice. And as part of our title dealing with climate and environmental justice, we included new programs to fund cleaner ports, a lot of emissions, ships, trucks. They're spewing stuff, mostly diesel powered, putting bad stuff up in the air for us to breathe. But a lot of money to fund cleaner ports, cleaner medium and heavy duty vehicles, programs to address clean air and climate pollution in disadvantaged communities, and a program designed to help low income and disadvantaged communities use federal dollars to leverage private investments in clean energy projects, just to name a few. My mom used to take my sister and I in West Virginia, later on in Virginia, used to take us to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, and most Thursday nights. People don't know they had church on Thursday nights. Well, we did in our community. And my mom took us all there those 4 different days or nights. And we'd go home afterwards, and she'd turn on television, and we'd watch Billy Graham. And she wanted to make sure of 2 things. One, she wanted to make sure that we invested and really took to heart the golden rule. Treat other people the way you want to be treated, most important rule of all. Believe it or not, it's in every major religion of the world. I don't care if you're Catholic, Protestant, I don't care if you're Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, it's there in every one of them. The other thing, she and my dad too, my dad was a big hunter and fisherman. They wanted to make sure that we understand we have a moral obligation to take care of this planet. And those are the things, some of the things that we sought to instill with us. Back to my script. Methane emission reduction program. Methane, I look at Laura. Methane, I'm thinking, Laura, that methane is about 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. That's a lot. There's something called HFCs, HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, but they're 1,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But methane's about 80 times more potent. We included in our legislation the first ever methane fee, escalating methane fee from the oil and gas, on methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. Negotiated that with Joe Manchin and his team. And over an extended period of time, but we negotiated, and it's put it in the bill, and it stayed in the bill. And it's a huge accomplishment. But in fact, believe it or not, we added, I think, some 6 or 7, I think it's 7 in new sections, the Clean Air Act, in our bill. Literally take from our bill, make changes in the Clean Air Act, changing one of our nation's bedrock environmental laws. And we did it as part of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the most, I think this might be the most significant changes and enhancements since maybe the adoption of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, which I worked on as a Congress a zillion years ago. I also serve on, we serve on a couple of different committees. One of my other committees is Finance Committee, and we do work a lot on tax policy. And we work a lot on tax policy that affects, is designed to encourage the kind of behavior that's good for our planet, good for our environment, good for our health, and discourages that which is not. But we work to ensure that the Inflation Reduction Act included historic incentives to help clean energy industry grow. I won't go through them all, but in investment tax credits and production tax credits for stuff like green hydrogen, you'll hear a lot more about clean hydrogen go for. Still investing in solar. When I was a grad student at the U of D a million years ago, I got to develop, everybody in one of my classes was required to develop a manufacturing process on a product of your choice. I chose solar panels. That was like before you guys were born. And I was like ahead of my time, and now I get to write the tax law that actually incentivizes next generation for solar. And you think, boy, you know that must be, it's fun, and it's fun for me and exciting as well. But offshore wind, there's a place about 20 miles off the coast of Delaware, where in the Atlantic Ocean, where the wind doesn't blow too hard or too soft, or it doesn't blow intermittent. It's just right. It's like what was the porridge? Goldilocks, yeah. It's the wind that just, as it turns out, there's a lot of places on the East Coast where that's the case. I was just at the IBEW, big celebration, 125th anniversary of the electrical workers in the state of Delaware, and they've just entered in a project labor agreement with Ørsted on offshore wind projects all the way from New England down to Virginia. That's a huge accomplishment, a huge advance, and it helps secure the support of labor for this industry. Not everybody likes nuclear, but we're interested. I'm a Navy guy, nuclear guy, and there's a place for advanced nuclear, and safe, reliable, and I think that's not a huge part of what we're doing going forward, but it's part of that. But there's a whole a bunch of tax provisions. I won't go through them all, but they're good stuff. Good stuff to help us elicit the kind of behavior that will make our planet safer and longer. We all know, though, the one piece of legislation alone won't solve climate crisis. There's a lot of more work to be done, and that's why, after enacting the largest climate law ever, I was proud to see my colleagues come together last month to ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Let me hear you say Kigali. One more time, Kigali. All right. My wife said to me about 3-4 years ago, she said, stop talking about Kigali. She said, stop talking about HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. She said, nobody cares. Nobody cares. Well, as it turns out, people do care. And it's worth, in a day and age when we're trying to keep the temperature of our planet going up more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, the phase down of these HFCs is a refrigerant. It's this thing, air conditioning, coolers, refrigerant. The phase down by 85% over the next 15 years of those refrigerants is worth 0.5 degree Celsius. So if we're trying to avoid the temperature going up by 1.5 degrees, it's just one thing. It's one thing. And the even better thing is it's American technology that'll put literally thousands of people to work in this country, invented in America, science and American companies, and we're talking about billions of dollars of economic activity. So is it possible to do good things for our planet and create jobs and economic opportunity? It certainly is. And I love my wife, but she was wrong on HFCs, and don't tell her I said that. But at the end of the day, these historic accomplishments are going to address climate change in very tangible ways. Importantly, these actions are going to do so in a way that creates good paying jobs, lowers costs for many Americans, and leaves no community behind. Proof that we can do good and do well at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, the magnitude of climate change requires well-coordinated global action to transition away from fossil fuels. And I believe the U.S. has never been in a better position to provide leadership on climate, and other things as well, but especially leadership on climate. Not just do as we say, but actually do as we do. Next month, the United Nations will hold its 27th Climate Change Conference in Egypt. It's called COP27. Let's go to the COP. And those of us traveling to the COP with the U.S. delegation are going to be able to say when we get there, do as we're doing, follow our leadership. I've been trained as a leader since I was a little boy, as a Cub Scout, and a Boy Scout, and Silver Patrol Cadet, a naval officer, and on and on and on. I've been around great leaders and some that weren't so great. I probably learned more from the ones that weren't so great than those who were. But I want to close with these words about leadership. And some of us you've probably heard before, but maybe some not. Leaders are humble, not haughty. Leaders have the heart of a servant. They understand that your job is to serve, not be served. Leaders have the courage to stay out of step when everyone else is marching to the wrong tune. They treat others the way they want to be treated, golden rule. They unite, not divide. They build bridges, not walls. Leaders surround themselves with the best people they can find. When the team does well, the leader gives the credit to the team, and when the team falls short, the leader takes the blame. Leaders don't build themselves up by tearing others down. Leaders are aspirational. They appeal to people's better angels. A fellow named Camus, a French philosopher, used to say, leaders are purveyors of hope. Einstein used to say it a little bit differently. He used to say, as I said this once before, this is like, if you remember nothing else, remember, in adversity lies opportunity. Leaders always seek to do what is right, not what is easy or expedient, but what is right. They focus on excellence in everything they do. Like to say, if it isn't perfect, let's make it better. Leaders treat other people the way they want to be treated, golden rule. And finally, when leaders know they're right, sure they're right, they never give up. Just never give up. I never give up. And sometimes when we take that kind of attitude, and even if something as daunting as climate change, we can, and the Navy used to say, like, turn the ship, turn the aircraft carrier. And if we use the analogy of climate change, the climate crisis, at an aircraft carrier that's on a course to oblivion for us, we've turned the aircraft carrier. And we're going to keep carrying it with your help, and I'm as encouraged about it as I've ever been in my life. And I hope after today, maybe you will be too. Thank you so much.
Senator Carper, thank you so much for those words, and to President Wrighton and Dean Goldman for opening us up here today. We're so grateful to all of you for spending some time with us here today out of your busy schedule. I'm Susan Anenberg.
Tell people who you are.
I'm sorry?
Tell people who you are. Go
Yes,
ahead.
thank you. I'm Susan Anenberg. I'm the director of the Climate and Health Institute here at the George Washington University.
I thought she was a student. I really did.
I appreciate that after having 3 kids. And I'm also an associate professor here in the Milken Institute School of Public Health. I'm standing up here because we have a live stream happening with many people online watching your words and us talk here today. So hello to the live stream people. And I am fortunate enough that I work here in a community of people at George Washington University who are researchers and engaged in the policy process. And as such, we had many people who had very good questions that they would like to pose to you. And in the interest of time, I will pose a couple of them here to you, if you don't mind. These come from a combination of faculty in the School of Public Health, in the law school, and in public policy. So the first one is the Inflation Reduction Act is an exciting step forward in mobilizing long overdue federal government engagement to address the climate crisis in the U.S. The IRA's approach has been labeled as all carrots and no sticks, which raises concerns that the IRA will not move the country forward fast enough to meet its climate governance goals given the urgency of the crisis. Do you see the IRA as a foothold for more ambitious federal government responses to climate change in the near future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I put the Inflation Reduction Act sort of like in the middle. It's not the only thing we're doing. It is not the only thing that we're doing. In fact, I mentioned the legislation the president signed into law 10 months ago on infrastructure, biggest infrastructure bill we've ever done. But it includes in there money for charging stations, fueling stations, and an effort to try to buy down the cost of people buying vehicles. There's a woman named Mary Barra. You've probably heard of her. She's CEO of General Motors. Smart cookie. I met her about 10 years ago at the Detroit Auto Show. And Delaware used to build more cars per capita than any other state in America, including a General Motors plant. And 10 years ago, the car of the year was a car called the Chevrolet Volt. And it was a hybrid. It was, it would only go 38 miles on a charge. 38 miles, and then you had to get gasoline and use fuel, but 38 miles on a charge. I bought about a little over a year ago, an electric vehicle. It gets 300 miles on a charge. And we provide tax incentives, state level, federal level, for people to buy vehicles like that. I remember calling Mary Barra about a year or two ago, and I was trying to get General Motors to sign on and do what Volvo and Ford and some other auto companies were doing in terms of supporting stronger standards for global emissions. And I tried to get her to sign up GM, and she wouldn't do it. And she basically said to me in so many words, it was her last administration, she said, if we do this, they'll find a way to cut our throats, or cut us off at an easier time. She said, we're not going to do that. But she said, when we'll have an election, we'll have a new administration, and we'll be right there. And General Motors, I think, what it helped me on this, if you will, but I think they're Ford and GM. I get them confused a little bit. Well, one of them is going to stop building fossil fuel-powered vehicles at all. I think in 2035, and the other is going to make some significant reductions. Mary Barr said to me this on electric vehicles. She said 3 things that people need in order before they're going to buy these electric vehicles. She said, number 1, they need 300-mile range. She said, that's on us, the industry. She said, number 2 is the batteries are charged in minutes, not hours, and that's on the industry. She said, number 3 is charging stations everywhere, so that people can conveniently recharge their vehicles, not have range anxiety. She said, that's on government. And what we've tried to do in the infrastructure bill we passed 10 months ago, and what we've done again in spades with this legislation, with the IRA, we have provided just great incentives for building charging stations and fueling stations. And the other thing we've done is methane reduction. People say it's not punitive. What we do, we incent those that are emitting, oil and gas companies, we're incenting them to reduce their emissions, methane emissions, and I think it's a great approach.
Fantastic, thank you.
I can give shorter answers.
That's you can talk as long as you'd like to.
Don't say that, you'll encourage me.
Just wanted to congratulate you on the historic achievement of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that effort as well as others.
It also reduces inflation. That's a story for another day.
But all of your efforts throughout your career have been quite beneficial for public health and environmental quality, so just really appreciate that. The Inflation Reduction Act is designed to accelerate the transition from the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity to greater reliance on renewable energy. Is that going to be possible with the enactment of permitting reform of the kind favored by Senator Manchin? Do you favor some form of permitting reform, and if so, what should it look like? Do you think Congress should preempt state authority over the location and installation of electric transmission lines to remove obstacles to broaden access to clean energy?
Great question. I've been a naval flight officer for 20 years, Delaware's treasurer, congressman, governor, senator, and served in the Senate now for 22 years. For the 22 years I've been privileged to serve in the Senate. We haven't done permitting reform every year, but we have done a lot. And most recently, huge changes in permitting that we did in the context of the major infrastructure legislation that was enacted almost a year ago. And what we've done is to take the approach that came out of permitting reform in the context of bipartisan infrastructure legislation, and said, how can we apply that today, update it today, and as we do permitting reform anew. And the idea is to, we've got people who are interested in trying to get, we'll say, this is one part of the country over here, and over here we have all this clean energy that we're generating, and over here we have folks need it, who could use it, and we're having a hard time getting the electricity to them. And one of the things that can flow from smart permitting reform is to make sure that we have the ability to transmit and to move that electricity in ways that make sense. So there's a way to do this, and there's a way to do this smartly, but we have to make sure that as we do make changes in permitting, that we don't do it in a way that's environmentally unsound. We want to make sure that we do it in a way that actually reflects our concerns for the least of these in our society, an equity issue.
Great, thank you. And we have many more questions, but I think we have to let you get to your next appointment. So just please join me in thanking Senator Carper.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Thanks very much. And thank you. Please remain standing. No, you can sit down. I'll say this in closing. How many of you actually, raise your hands, go sit down. How many of you actually been to Delaware, actually got out of your car, didn't just pay the toll on I-95, you actually got out of your car, maybe visited one of the, we have more 5-star beaches than I think any state in the country. We have, I think the newest, the national park in the country. We have had for the last 2 years the best state park system in the country. We have no sales tax. We have just a terrific congressional delegation. Well, maybe not that. We got a lot to offer. We also have, as yesterday it's been part of yesterday in southern part of our state, and we have 2 national wildlife refuges. They are a gift from God. They are just beautiful. And so come and see us, come and visit us, and we promise you that you might do what I did, and that's actually stick around. Thank you. God bless you all. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And we're going to take about a 15-minute break, and then we'll start our first panel. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. Am I being heard? Is the sound working here and online as well? Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to reconvene this session. I'm sure that all of you found the last one to be as inspiring as I did. It was wonderful to have the senator with us, and I think that in many ways that presentation helped set the stage for what this panel is going to be doing. And again, we're here talking about protecting public health through U.S. climate action and trying to make sense of this shifting landscape. We heard quite a bit from the senator about the Inflation Reduction Act and other legislative accomplishments of the last year. We didn't hear very much about the second part of that, the West Virginia versus EPA decision, and I'm hoping, in the context of this panel that we'll hear about that as well. Now, normally people like me get up in front of an audience and give you the entire litany of all of the terrible things that climate is doing to impact our health. And I'm not going to do that because I want to have as much time as possible for the contributions of our panel. But I will say that we have reached a point where, as the senator said, it is code red. It is code red. The impacts in the United States and globally are so apparent at this point that there's very little argument about, one, whether climate change is actually happening. I think we've resolved that. Two, whether health is impacted. A lot of the debate really now is, what do we do about it? How do we do that? Under what kind of a time scale? How urgent is it? And so I'm happy that we've moved from whether to how, and that I think most people understand the why. But there are still challenges that lie ahead, and I'm hoping that we can get into that with this panel. I should say that for me also very much framing this is that our School of Public Health is a part of an entire association of schools and programs of public health across the country that just made a decision to adopt a framework for providing education and research around climate and health. And I think that this is going to be true of medical schools, nursing schools, health sciences schools of all kinds, as well as our schools that have more traditionally been involved with sustainability and health. And so that I know that many of you here in the room are somehow associated with either our public health school, our school of medicine, our nursing school, and other health schools. And I think that more and more in your careers that you will have an opportunity, and in fact it will be imperative that many of you will be working on this issue. So with my brief sermon over, it is now my great pleasure to be able to just very briefly introduce this panel. We have with us Vickie Patton, who is with the Environmental Defense Fund. She is their general counsel. We have Gretchen Goldman, who is with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, who is leading much of the science in this area for the federal government. And we have with us Sarah Colangelo, who is with the Georgetown University Law School, who is quite an expert in the area of not only climate and the law, but also environmental justice. And so I'm going to invite each member of the panel to give a brief lead off, starting with Vickie Patton. And yes, mic's on.
Thank you so much for hosting this conference and the opportunity to be here. I just wanted to start by thanking Senator Carper publicly. When he talked about at the end, like one of his life lessons is never give up, he lives it, and he lived it on this kind of roller coaster journey that climate legislation was on. There were a number of times, including some times at the very end of the legislative process, where it felt like to everyone involved, the door was closed. And to Senator Carper, the door is never closed. And so he pushed the door open, he found pathways forward, and he altered the arc of history. And I want to thank him, I want to thank his staff, because their service to our country is really extraordinary. It'll be a tremendous legacy. This is a manufacturing renaissance clean solutions, and red, purple, and blue states alike. These are changes to the Clean Air Act that we will dig into, but just to give you a little, that Senator Carper ushered in for the first time in our lives. It says the words environmental justice in our nation's clean air laws. Senator Carper, wrote multiple places throughout our nation's clean air laws that greenhouse gases are air pollutants. This will be a lasting legacy, and so just thank you to all of you who made that happen. We are hugely grateful. So a year ago this month, the Supreme Court granted review in this climate case, and it was surprising. There were a number of just conservative experts in the legal community who thought the court would never grant review for a number of reasons. One was because there were no emission standards in effect. And EPA Administrator Michael Regan, during his confirmation hearing before Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, made it eminently clear he had no intention of ever implementing the emission standards that were in question and being debated. He said, we are going to go back and have a clean slate. They wrote that to the states and to EPA regional offices, clean slate, we're going to start over. And nevertheless, the High Court granted review. And there were people who stepped up in that litigation that I just want to thank. Sarah Colangelo, just a brilliant attorney who represented a coalition of leading public health organizations, medical associations, and Dr. Lynn Goldman, who stepped up and helped bring that coalition together. I would urge anyone who thinks about the intersection of public health and climate and the law to read that brief. It is like a brilliant exegesis explaining what is at stake for human health, for community health. And so we can make sure it's available to everyone who's interested. But there were a number of people who stepped up to share their expert views with the High Court. The court issued a ruling on the very last day of its term in which it constrained EPA's authority to address climate pollution from existing fossil fuel power plants in a key way by really constraining EPA's authority to rely on clean solutions. And the power sector itself always sort of relies on this generation shifting from high-emitting solutions to clean solutions. It operates, that's how it functions in the grid. And EPA, taking its cues from what the power sector itself does to shift pollution, to mitigate pollution, said, we're gonna set emission standards that reflect how the power sector itself operates in mitigating pollution and shifting from high-emitting to clean. And the court said EPA exceeded its authority in doing that. Why does that matter? That matters because our nation's power plants, the fossil fuel power plants, are responsible for 1.5 billion tons of warming gases. That makes the US power sector alone one of the single largest sources in the world. If it was a country, it would be one of the single largest sources of climate destabilizing pollution. It is also a major source of smog-forming nitrogen oxides. It is a major source of lethal particles. And so having zero-emitting clean solutions as part of the way our country tackles this problem is really important. The court also enunciated what they call the major questions doctrine. And I just want to spend a little bit of time on that, and then we can, and what they did is the court said there are going to be an extraordinary set of cases where judges will decide that matters of such socioeconomic significance that they are going to require a clear statement from Congress. And so we don't really know what that doctrine means. It is a vague doctrine, and what is happening now is a number of opponents of safeguards for climate action, for human health, are invoking now that doctrine to impede agencies that are entrusted by Congress with taking action from doing that. It's now sort of burgeoning across the country in a number of different forums. When now Justice Kavanaugh was a judge on the DC Circuit, he dissented from the denial of rehearing en banc in the net neutrality case, and he gave his hints about this major questions doctrine. He said, yes, I believe in this doctrine, and I can't really explain it. You know it when you see it. And so in the Clean Air Act, what that means is that Congress has written a statute that by design was intended to incorporate the best public health science, that by design was intended by Congress to respond to new solutions and new technologies. Congress wrote the statute that way to be adaptive and to help meet society's needs and to help protect community health, to help us tackle the climate crisis. And now we have this doctrine that supersedes kind of that design, that language, that intent of Congress. And so, the Chief Justice has talked about the court calling balls and strikes. And what we are living now is a world where the court is throwing curveballs at the American people. And those curveballs have a strong anti-democratic dimension to them. When Justice Elena Kagan spoke at Northwestern Law School before the start of the new term, she said publicly, we as a court have to be very careful. We are imperiling our legitimacy. And the case she pointed to in her public remarks was this case, this climate change case. And so there are enormous stakes. And we can talk more about how the Inflation Reduction Act tackles that and addresses that. But that is the context of this really damaging Supreme Court ruling.
Thank you so much. Now turning to Gretchen Goldman. No relation.
Not that we know of. Well, thank you for that. So I think this is a really interesting panel for us to combine because we can talk about all these different dimensions. And there's this sort of these looming bigger challenges, as you heard Vickie talk about. And we also have a lot of action that's happening right now in terms of things happening on the ground, money going out the door, thinking more about how do we, especially given potential long-term threats, what do we do right now to really help communities, to set us on the right track, to meet that 2050 goal of net zero, and do a lot more as we continue on. And so I wanted to dig a little deeper into some of the things that Senator Carper talked about and thinking more about what we can do right now to help us on that track to tackle the climate crisis and address environmental inequities in bigger ways. And so the Biden-Harris administration has since day one, been very focused on tackling the climate crisis. And importantly, as part of that, it's always had this equity centered in it. And so thinking about environmental injustices, how do we think about that in the context of climate risk, but also as a separate challenge of these longstanding legacy pollutants and ways that we need to do better to address existing environmental inequities on top of the new ones that are posed or will be posed by climate change. And so that's been a focus of the administration since day one. One part of that is the flagship Justice 40 program, which is designed to ensure that for at least 40% of clean energy and climate investments of this administration are going towards disadvantaged communities to drive investments there. And importantly, that program came from environmental justice leaders. It was in discussion and shaped by and from the environmental justice communities, as well as it's focused on really driving home those benefits benefits in communities. So thinking about what are the health benefits of investments, what are other sorts of outcomes that we can tangibly see on the ground. And it includes elements of accountability. So having a scorecard that comes out of that, really looking at what do the benefits look like? Are we doing a good job of getting those resources, those benefits to the communities that need them most? And so that program was in place long before some of the legislative victories that you heard Senator Carper talk about. So I wanted to mention that first as being a really innovative new program, and never before has environmental justice been raised to the level of the White House in the way that it is under Justice 40 and this administration's priorities. And so then on top of that, we had the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And as you heard, had referenced, this is the single largest climate investment that's ever been made. There's a lot of things ways that bill is historic, and one of them is those climate provisions. It lowers energy costs. We see, you heard Senator Carper mention, it has tax credits for electric vehicles and other clean energies at the residential scale, so rooftop solar or heat pumps, and really trying to drive those investments at residences, and that's gonna lower energy costs. And it also works to build a clean energy economy at a bigger scale. It includes really, truly unprecedented scales of building solar panels, wind turbines, battery plants. We've never seen investment and onboarding of clean energy sources in the way that this bill is driving. This law is driving. And it's also reducing that harmful pollution that is caused both from greenhouse gases, so it drives huge reductions in greenhouse gases by 1 gigaton by 2030, which is 10 times the climate impact of any other single piece of legislation in our nation's history. And on top of those really critical greenhouse gas emission reductions, that is going to drive our ability to meet that goal of being below 2005 levels by 2030. It's also providing huge health benefits from reduction of other pollutants. So that particulate matter, particle pollution that comes from some of the same sources as greenhouse gases. And that's really important for community health benefits, because it's those pollutants that we see really driving a lot of the environmental inequities that we see today, and causing a lot of the health burdens that we see from pollution in this country. So with that reduction in those emissions, we're going to see huge benefits in terms of reduced asthma cases, incidences in the emergency room, reduced mortality from air pollution. And so those are really huge benefits that we're seeing in this bill as well. And the law also addresses environmental injustices in other huge ways. There's $60 billion in the bill in provisions that will drive investments in disadvantaged communities. Much of that will be covered under the Justice 40 program, and so it'll be subject to a lot of those same provisions that are intended to drive investments in those communities, and will be measured that way. Specifically, it includes $3 billion in block grants directly to community neighborhoods. And it also includes a lot of really important new science in this context. And so there's new funding for fence line monitoring and collecting data and coordination around cumulative impacts. These are really important parts of the bill, even though they haven't gotten a lot of attention, because these are pieces of data and monitoring and science that have been neglected for a long time. And that's one thing that has led to a lot of environmental inequities that we see, is not having that fence line monitoring places, not having the resources and the coordination that's needed to make connections between what communities are exposed to, what are those health impacts, and how do we address it at the policy level. And You heard Senator Carper talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law as being a huge driver in this space as well. That increases our climate resilience. It builds clean tech infrastructure and supply chains, and it invests in our workers. But because I'm coming from the White House Science Office, I would also be remiss to not mention the also very important CHIPS and Science Act that passed this year as well. And that also has a huge role to play in this space because the CHIPS Act is going to drive equitable clean tech innovation and technology and manufacturing and a lot of the regional economic growth. And that's a really critical piece when we're talking about what is really needed to have a clean energy economy. We really need all of that manufacturing to exist. We need those investments here, and that's going to drive costs down. It's going to increase the speed of adoption of clean energy technologies. And so that's this other critical piece that I think often is not mentioned in the same category. And so when we look together, all of these laws together, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act, together these unlock new possibilities because then with all three, we're building that infrastructure, those supply chains, the technology, and the comprehensive industrial policy that we'll need and will be absolutely necessary for us to meet these ambitious climate goals and emissions reductions goals. And so this is a really huge moment where we have the opportunity to make a lot of progress in a really short amount of time in terms of politics. And so the last thing I would just say about that, and I'll leave it to my lawyer colleagues to talk about some of the other legal implications, but the last thing I wanted to say about all of that is that one sort of unique element of these laws, and especially the Inflation Reduction Act, is the long-term investments that they are creating, both directly and indirectly. So first, a lot of the provisions are longer term than a lot of climate tax credits and other policies have been. And so that's really going to drive a lot more change because it's giving people, it's giving industry a lot more certainty about how long these provisions will be in place and what we can drive, and that's going to drive further investment. And the private sector role is a really critical piece of that. A lot of these elements are designed to, get more of that manufacturing on the ground in the U.S. to make these investments, and these are not things that will change even if there's a change in policy in the near future and future administrations or legal decisions. We see that private sector investment that it will stay for longer. And so that's a huge piece of that. And we tend to underestimate how much costs will come down of clean energy and how much private sector innovation will evolve over time. And so we have that to consider here as well as we look at how the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be implemented. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks for that point. Thank you so much. Sarah Colangelo.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to GW for hosting this. Am I on? I think I'm on. Yes, I can move this up too. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So I wanted to thank GW and to thank everyone for putting this panel together. And I have to just make a remark based on what Vickie so generously said during her points earlier, that our brief on the public health effects of climate change would not have been possible without the amazing work done by people from GW, lending their medical expertise, but also their coalition building skills. It just would not have been possible, so we're so grateful for that.
And I should mention Dr. Annenberg in that context.
Yes, absolutely.
Who is just amazing, as well
I keep
as
gesturing to her.
as well as Jonathan Pabst, who wanted to be on this panel, and because of a COVID issue, how many times is that happening to us? That that's putting a little bit of a wrench into the works, but
yeah,
anyway.
That's right. So the benefit of going third on a panel like this is that I can draw, hopefully, some linkages between some remarks that you've heard already and some remarks from the senator. But one thing that really struck me about what Gretchen said, and I wrote it down about, this is a time of unlocking new possibilities, was her phrase. So I'm going to suggest that this is a time of possibility, but also peril right now. And I think that sets up the framework in the difference between what happened in the West Virginia decision, and then on the heels of that, we had the passage of the IRA. So I'm going to focus my remarks on the West Virginia case on the environmental justice implications of the decision, both the substance of the decision and how the reasoning and the rationale laid out by the Chief Justice, I think, will affect environmental justice moving forward. So as this audience is well aware, but I'm going to name this anyway, this is a public health decision. This decision will have clear public health implications. We already know this, but climate change is altering weather patterns and natural cycles around the world. This results in things like more frequent heat waves, higher average temperatures, more forest fires and urban fires, more air pollution, longer and intensified allergy seasons, more potent and frequent storms and floodings, just to name a few. All of these, of course, pose dangerous health consequences, a reduction in the quality of life, missed school and work days, hospitalizations, lives shortened, and lives lost. And I name these because while the consequences are borne across the United States, red and blue states and purple states, and that's very important. We tried to, in our brief, we tried to show the justices that. I don't think it reached all of them, unfortunately. But to be clear, even though it's happening everywhere, these consequences are disproportionately borne by our society's most vulnerable populations: infants and children, pregnant women, the elderly, and they're borne disproportionately by people of non-white racial identity and under-resourced communities. And so first, in high level, the opinion's constraint on EPA's regulatory options and any delay that causes in regulatory action towards progress on climate will be experienced most intensely by those communities and those segments of our population. And to be clear, these are some key linkages you've heard now in most of the remarks today. These are communities that are most often suffering an ambient environment that's already saturated with other forms of pollution. Sometimes you hear the phrase cumulative impacts, and that's what we're really talking about there. So other sources of pollution and environmental stressors, and they're often coincidentally on the front lines of climate change. So to take just one example, oftentimes, or I should say more often, people of non-white racial identity or lower income, people who earn lower incomes, find themselves with homes that are in flood zones and that are more prone to flooding and storm surge, all right? And they're often more likely to have higher incidences of underlying health conditions, heart conditions, and pulmonary conditions that would make them more vulnerable to the health consequences of climate change that I just mentioned. And that's again, before we even get to climate change, we're already talking about vulnerable populations. So that's why we say at first the substance of the opinion, the reduction or the constraint, you could call it, on EPA authority to act, that's already damaging from an environmental justice perspective. But the way the opinion was crafted in rolling out the major questions doctrine, in signaling quite overtly, so it's probably something stronger than signaling, a strong skepticism of administrative action that's also likely to have environmental justice implications. So first, many of us who are looking at this are worried that the major questions doctrine is going to have a chilling effect on risk-adverse agencies, bless you. Not just EPA, but other agencies that are considering novel or aggressive climate action. By definition, the major questions doctrine looks at the action quite closely if it's something an agency has never done before. That's very problematic when you have agencies who haven't acted on climate before but want to act now. So we have that chilling effect. We also could have barriers to congressional progress. And so the IRA is quite an incredible achievement against this background. And it's a different type of legislation. It's a reconciliation bill. And so there's concern that the major questions doctrine could impose an extremely difficult standard on Congress. As you heard Vickie talk about, this is a standard that requires a clear statement from Congress before they do or turn over, delegate authority on major issues. But that's not how Congress speaks about major issues. Congress sets forth broad goals and delegates to experts within the government the responsibility to fill in the details. They do that because Congress can't foresee everything when it comes to public health threats, like the pandemic, for example. But also, and the IRA is a great example of this, Congress has to use language that's built from compromise. And so by nature, that's not going to be crystal clear. So many of us are quite worried about how the major questions doctrine will play out when it comes to legislation. And we're seeing new bills being introduced about environmental justice, but there's real question for how this doctrine could, again, have that chilling effect or prove to be a barrier. And finally, I will say I think the decision solidifies the quite strong deregulatory tilt that Vickie referenced in her remarks. This is a deregulatory tilt in the interpretive playing field of not only the Supreme Court, but across the judiciary. There's someone in the room will know this, but I think President Trump appointed 200 federal judges. Does that sound right, maybe? Any experts? Okay, 200. So, the judiciary has changed across the government. We talk a lot about the Supreme Court, but we need to think about judges across the country who are taking their marching orders and looking at this doctrine. And really, there is quite a concern now, again, that was referenced in earlier remarks, that with just very little invocation from advocates, we can see progressive environmental protections for communities that desperately need it. We could see those environmental protections be labeled as major. And so again, the major questions doctrine is so vague and malleable that really presents quite a danger. We're seeing that being rolled out in briefs now being filed across the country already. So all of those are reasons for concern from this opinion, again, based not just on the substance of the opinion related to climate action itself, but how the opinion was crafted. The last thing that I'll say is that we, of course, and this is, I think we'll get into this a little bit more maybe in the second panel, people read this opinion and say, well, we still have state action. That's absolutely true. And we still have private sector, also true, and wonderful action is happening on both those fronts. But it's uneven. And that's always worrisome when it comes to communities that have traditionally borne this burden. Also, right now, anything that drives action away from agencies is also of concern. Right now, our federal agencies under the Biden administration are actually doing a wonderful and commendable job engaging communities, listening to concerns, and elevating the voices of communities so that they can define their problems and their solutions. So we like what's happening there, and we don't want all the action to move out of the hands of agencies. So I'm not usually a doom and gloom kind of speaker. That was maybe a little doom and gloom, and hopefully we can give some hope in Q&A.
Well, thanks, Sarah. And actually, so I'm looking at the questions that came in advance, and the good news is that, and they're not major questions, but most of them actually were addressed by the panel. But there's one, and I thought I would just toss this one to you since we are going to need to move to a break in a little while. And that is that given what we've discussed, and also where we are at this moment in history, which I agree with the senator. This is truly a pivotal moment. I have been working on this issue for a long, long time. And as he said, there are scientists who for years and years and years have been going, hello, hello, pay attention. And suddenly, there is attention being paid. It is an amazing moment in time. But what does that mean for the other people in this room, for the people who are watching the webinar, in particular people in the next generation who are interested in helping to advance climate action and climate justice goals? Do you have a message for them, whether they're interested in advocacy or legal work or working on the science, working on public health aspects? What is your advice for them? Maybe starting with Gretchen.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll say I'll take this one as myself as opposed to the Biden administration, which I don't know the opinion of on this topic. But I'd say in general there is so much potential to work on this issue from all kinds of angles. You can do the science, you can do the law, you can do both. You can think about how this intersects at the community level, the communication side. There's so many layers to this, and there's so many more opportunities as there's more and more opportunities at different levels and awareness, and I would just say don't feel like you need to constrain yourself to one piece of it. I'm a environmental engineer by training, and I found that it was just incredibly helpful to be a technical person that is interested in and can get versed in thinking about policy and what the impact of that science is on the world, because we need people like that. We need people with technical training and technical skills, but that are interested and willing to use that expertise in policy settings to step up and do that. And so I took the policy route in doing that. But I'd say even if you, as we've sort of heard on this panel, even scientists that stay in sort of research and stay in academia, it is hugely valuable to have those perspectives and to be engaged on policy. You just heard this really awesome example about Dean Goldman being involved and Dr. Anenberg. And so there's really just this huge need for technical experts to inform decisions and policy and work on all these different pieces of climate. So that would be my pitch if you're a science person.
Gretchen, if I could just push that one step further. I mean, many of us are from a generation where climate scientist was almost a dirty word. People were actually personally attacked for being involved in that area of research. Agency websites were purged of words like climate. Agencies were afraid to fund grants that had the word climate change in the abstract, that they would be attacked for that. And I'm hoping we've moved past that. I mean, what do you see as the outlook for young people getting into this as an area of research, whether they want to be an advocate or not? Maybe they don't want to be an advocate. Maybe they want to contribute 100% by doing the science. Are we moving beyond that era?
Yeah, I think it's a very different world now, right? There's a lot more happening now, and there's a lot. So when I was an undergrad, I took global warming, a class called global warming, and it was 6 kids in the class. And that would never be true now, right? I don't know what your intro climate change class is, but I'm sure it's more than 6 people, right? So I think there's just huge potential. There's way more interest in it, and I think that will be true even if there's short-term political changes where there's different sort of priorities, because there's just so much more to do. There's so much more awareness, and I think you do to be, of course, engaged on lots of issues. You need somewhat of a thick skin. I think there is going to always be criticism, but scientists are used to that anyway, and so I think it's it's not. Don't shy away from it because you're afraid of that.
Vickie, do you have a response to that?
This And I want to just refer back to the really important question in response to Senator Carper's opening remarks about carrots and sticks. And the Inflation Reduction Act contains both. It contains a historic investment in clean solutions, historic. And there's a new report out from Credit Suisse that estimates that it's far greater than the $369 billion because many of the incentives are not capped. And so it can create an enormous amount of supply. And we also need the demand. And that demand comes from pollution standards. And EPA and other, and communities and mayors and states can now move forward with policies that will be a fraction of the cost that they would have been, both because the learning curve in creating the opportunity for clean, and because you have these historic investments and these solutions. So this is the time to go big at scale in your local community and state policy, nationally, and really it's up to all of us and what happens. You know, the outcomes are not preordained, right? There are people who were persecuted because they believed in the climate science. There are people who are attacked because they believe in environmental justice and they raise their voices for justice. These outcomes are not preordained. They are up to all of us to decide that today we are going to translate these words on paper and this historic law into climate action at scale, into environmental justice that is deep and authentic, and that is the $3 billion that on the community and environmental justice grants. The words in the statute say they should be community-led. Community-led. They need to be community-led. And to do that in a way that provides shared economic prosperity so that we build a healthier democracy. That is this moment, and we need your help. All hands on deck.
Keep your Sarah.
Absolutely. So I want to videotape that and show that to my students. All hands on deck. I love it. One of the things, so I teach now in our environmental law and justice clinic. So we do real legal work on behalf of clients in the clinic. And then I've also taught larger environmental law classes as well. But one theme that carries across all of those moments for me with students is that I tell them that it's okay to have hope right now, but that we need resilience too. We need hope and resilience in this moment. That's all hands on deck, as Vickie said. What I talk to my students about at times like this, which again, the possibilities and the peril at this moment, is that we can focus on a few things. We can focus on developing excellent fundamentals of advocacy. We can focus on developing excellent fundamentals when it comes to statutory interpretation and our regulatory work and our regulatory skills. And when we send our law students off to become lawyers wherever they may go, but if they go to agencies or they go into to work on the Hill, they're bringing forward these regulatory skills to drive progress within various doctrines that the court may set out so that they're able to operate within these constraints that the court is setting forth. And if we do that, and then the third thing I would say besides those, the excellent fundamentals of advocacy and this focus on good regulatory work, the third thing I would say is centering communities. If we start to do that, this is really, really something now that the environmental movement as a whole is finally turning towards and focusing on. If we do that, we will always be driving forward on progress in a way that's, that does support our democracy, that creates just solutions in a way that we're in the way that we're moving forward. That's really important. So I try to think of things for my students that we can focus on regardless of who might be in the White House, regardless of what the next Supreme Court case may be that comes down. If we focus on those things, we can continue to make progress.
Thank you so much, and thanks to our panel for a wonderful set of presentations and for a wonderful discussion. I wish this could go on for another hour, but thanks to all of you. I think we have a 15-minute break at this point, but a round of applause for our panel, please.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started again for our second panel. Wow, that was an incredible last panel. Thank you. But I know that we have an incredible lineup of panelists for this second panel as well. So I'm Susan Anenberg. I introduced myself earlier, but I'm the director of the GW Climate and Health Institute and an associate professor here in the Milken Institute School of Public Health at GW. Thank you all for being here today. I'm just so energized by the discussions that we're having so far. And I'm very pleased to kick off this second panel here, which is a little bit more forward-looking. We have experienced these dramatic shifts in U.S. climate policy. In fact, I was on vacation in 1 week in August, and it happened to be the exact wrong week to be on vacation because everything changed within that 1 week, and it was really incredible. But now we can start to think, we have some contours of what our lives are going to be like with a new law in place, and let's start to think about how we move forward and implement that at state and local levels as well as the federal level. And I just want to start with something that Vickie Patton said in the last panel. I was scribbling furiously as she was saying these outcomes are not preordained. They're up to all of us to translate the words on the page into climate action at scale. And I don't know if maybe you've said that 100 times, but it was really incredible to hear such wisdom come from an off-the-cuff comment like that. But I just think that was so on point. And I'm very pleased to be introducing our panelists today to help us think through how we get from where we are now to a healthy climate in the future. So we have Professor Rob Glicksman, who is the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law here at George Washington University. Khalil Shahid, Managing Director for Environmental and Equity Strategies at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Kate Johnson, who is Head of U.S. Federal Affairs at C40 Cities. And Bill Dietz, who is the Director of the Sumner M. Redstone Global Center for Prevention and Wellness at the George Washington University. So thank you all for being here today, and I'll just ask each of you to give your opening comments for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to questions. So Professor Glicksman.
Thanks very much. So I want to pick up a little bit on the remarks made by Vickie and Sarah and talk just a little bit about the implications of West Virginia versus EPA going forward, and then I want to pivot to an area that nobody's talked about yet in terms of where we might see some progress going forward. So despite some fears of the environmental community, West Virginia versus EPA, as constraining as it is, didn't completely disable EPA from regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And I believe EPA is in the process of developing regulations to limit greenhouse gas emissions from the electric power sector within constraints hopefully spelled out by the court in West Virginia, an industry which is responsible for about 27% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. The Biden administration's EPA is also likely to adopt more stringent limits on emissions from new cars and trucks, which together account for about a quarter of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Now, Vickie mentioned that the Inflation Reduction Act, apparently at Senator Carper's urging, includes several provisions which define greenhouse gases as air pollutants. This is a hedge against the Supreme Court backtracking even more than it did in West Virginia versus EPA. There were some members of the current court who dissented from the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, where the court said that greenhouse gases qualify as air pollutants under the statute, giving EPA the authority to regulate them under the Clean Air Act. Some justices dissented at the time and have since said that they would overturn that case if they could today. So this case reinforces the notion that greenhouse gases are indeed air pollutants, subject to EPA's regulatory authority under the Clean Air Act. It was mentioned earlier about money that was made available under the Inflation Reduction Act for monitoring. This can help EPA figure out where new emission standards are needed based upon existing public health threats, where existing standards need to be enforced and then need to be adopted, and then will facilitate enforcement of those standards once they're in place. Finally, I think the Inflation Reduction Act, by providing subsidies to industries that are moving toward cleaner operations, will make it harder for industry to argue that any rigorous standards that EPA adopts are not economically feasible because they're now at least partially subsidized, which should reinforce EPA's authority to crack down, at least to some extent, on existing regulatory strategies. Yeah. But the Biden administration has made it clear that it's not all about EPA, even though that's where our focus has been today. Biden administration is engaged in an all-of-government effort to combat climate change. And so, for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission is contemplating adoption of a rule that would expand corporate obligations to disclose risks to their businesses that are associated with climate change. I have no doubt that someone is going to throw the major questions doctrine in the face of SEC if it adopts such a rule. We'll see how that comes out. But I want to spend my several few minutes discussing a different arm of the federal government, and in particular the role that the federal land management agencies can play in combating climate change. Federal government, you may not know this, but owns about 30% of the surface acreage of the United States. It has delegated responsibility to manage that huge amount of land to 4 agencies. 2 of them have mandates that focus on preservation and recreation. That's the National Park Service, which manages the national parks, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the national wildlife refuges. Extractive uses like oil and gas, mineral exploration, are more or less prohibited on these lands. The other 2 agencies are the U.S. Forest Service, which manages the National Forest System, and the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, or the BLM, which manages about 245 million acres of remaining federal lands. These 2 agencies operate under what's called a multiple-use sustained yield mandate. Unlike the national parks and national wildlife refuges, the national forests and the BLM public lands may be devoted to a wide range of uses that include things like wilderness preservation, wildlife protection, and recreation, but they can also commit their lands to extractive uses like mining and oil and gas production. And they have broad discretion to choose what uses to allow in particular locations. A third important extractive associated agency is the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, or BOEM, which, like the BLM, is part of the Interior Department. BOEM is responsible for managing lands on the outer continental shelf, including lands off the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf Coasts that are rich in oil and gas deposits. The Gulf Coast and the lands off the Alaskan coast have long been prized by the oil and gas industry. BOEM is in charge of efforts to lease these lands to private companies. President Biden has sought to limit the use of federal lands for onshore and offshore oil and gas leasing from the very beginning of his term in office. During his first week in office, he suspended new oil and gas leasing on federal lands pending a comprehensive review of the process by the Interior Department. A federal district court in Louisiana found that suspension to be illegal, but an appellate court a couple of months ago reversed that decision. The Inflation Reduction Act intervened, requiring the federal government to reinstate about $200 million in leases in the Gulf of Mexico. And it reinstated a lease sale in Alaska that the Biden administration had canceled. Finally, it requires the Interior Department to hold periodic oil and gas lease sales, both onshore and offshore. And so some of this activity, production of fossil fuels, is going to happen with the assistance of the federal land management agencies. But the administration, even though it can't issue a moratorium on further leasing because of the Inflation Reduction Act, does retain discretion to limit new lease sales in at least some locations. And even if it can't limit new leases, it can control the manner in which the oil and gas industry operates on leased federal lands. In particular, the land management agencies can take steps to limit methane emissions from venting, flaring, and leaking. We've heard already today that methane as a greenhouse gas is multiple times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so efforts to limit methane emissions from federal oil and gas leasing can have an enormous impact. We also heard that the Inflation Reduction Act imposes fees on methane emissions from operations under newly issued oil and gas leases, and those fees will increase over a period of years. And so the fees should act as an incentive for the industry to take steps to limit their methane output as a means of reducing their tax liability. Now, there's some uncertainty in this area. Federal courts have invalidated previous efforts by both the Obama administration to impose stringent new waste minimization requirements on federal oil and gas leasing operations, and by the Trump administration to totally scrap them. And BLM officials have indicated that those decisions leave them with some degree of uncertainty about what kinds of regulations they're going to be able to adopt going forward. Despite that, the BLM is considering requiring operators under federal oil and gas leases to prepare and comply with waste minimization plans and to use waste minimization technologies. I'll finish with this. The other side of the equation is that both the national forests and the BLM public lands include broad swaths of territory that are suitable and in some cases ideal for the development of clean energy resources like wind and solar energy. The Inflation Reduction Act repealed the 10-year moratorium that the Trump administration had imposed on offshore wind energy leasing by the federal government. President Biden has announced that he intends to double renewable energy outputs from public lands by the end of next year. Doing so could help the transition from energy production that's historically been dominated by fossil fuels to one that relies more heavily on energy development that doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions. The success of that effort could depend on the construction of new electric transmission lines to help move the energy from its production in remote locations to its consumption in population centers. Most of those lines will necessarily cross federal lands. The BLM is responsible for issuing rights of way across federal lands to help the siting of projects like massive solar energy production projects and transmission lines to carry power from its production location to where it's used. Both Congress and the agencies are exploring ways to streamline the right-of-way issuance process while making sure that doing so won't cause localized health and environmental problems, including problems for disadvantaged communities. So, federal land management agencies will have a lot to say about the future of climate change output by, number one, reducing emissions, especially methane emissions, and number two, enhancing the use of federal lands for clean energy production.
Thank you very much, Rob, and we'll turn to Khalil Shahid.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Khalil Shahid, Managing Director for Environmental Equity Strategies. I'll just start by saying, this is really an exciting time to be a part of the environmental movement. I work with a center within NRDC called the Environment Equity and Justice Center, which we created just over a year ago to focus our internal resources and capacity and expertise on ensuring that our environmental advocacy also meet goals for achieving environmental justice and social equity. And at the time that we created this center, our colleagues from our international program, particularly our China and our India office, reached out to us and said, hey, we'd really like the Equity Center's help in helping us to think about how to make climate financing equitable. And our response was, well, we've never done it because we never had climate financing until now. So, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, we have our first sort of like real federal investment, direct investment in climate change, climate action, climate resilience, and adaptation, both for communities, but also nature-based solutions. And so, and that work really came about, because of the new coalitions, that we're developing. Again, I work with NRDC. We are a very large international environmental organization, majority white organization, and we have not in the past had very good relationships, with frontline communities, with communities of color, with poor communities of any race, ethnic background, both in the U.S. and globally. But over the past 10 years, we've begun to really do that work both internally, but also with our partners and are developing new coalitions, new relationships, new partnerships. And a lot of the environmental justice and a lot of the community-focused investments that we saw in IRA came from that one of those coalitions that we formed with a coalition of environmental justice groups called the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. We worked with them, over the last 5 years and developed that agenda, and we kept going every week, every month, back to the Hill with the same agenda. And we were able to get those investments first into the Build Back Better framework, and we were able to keep them embedded in what became the IRA framework. And so those new coalitions are really giving us a much more dynamic approach to the way that we think about environmental problems. We're also developing new partnerships. There is a coalition, for example, such as the National Birth Equity Initiative. We have decades now worth of evidence and research about the racial inequities in environmental burdens, but also in climate change. But we have far less research, especially and evidence, especially domestically, on the gender-based dynamics of environmental inequity and climate injustice, particularly for women of color. And so working with organizations like the National Birth Equity Initiative, we're starting to finally begin to delve into gender-based disparities and the intersection of gender and race-based disparities, again, for women of color, particularly as it relates to birthing women and people and maternal and reproductive health. I wrote a blog when the draft decision of the Supreme Court came out striking down Roe against Wade on why reproductive justice is a climate justice issue. And people started reaching out to us, donors started reaching out to us and asking, what are we doing about this? And I was like, no one's doing anything. No one in the environmental movement is really doing this work yet. And so, we started asking them, these are some groups that are out here who we're drawing inspiration from and talking to and learning from. But if you can fund anything, if you can do anything today as students, is to begin to help us to collect the evidence base for gender-based disparities in environmental burdens and climate justice. And so these coalitions are really helping to shift the discussion, to shift the dialogue. But there's still a whole lot of work to do. We're still seeing our policy and being developed in a very reductionist, sort of least common denominator framework that we call carbon tunnel vision. And we see it in the way the IRA framework was kind of split out from the Build Back Better framework, where we passed the clean energy investments, we passed all the clean energy tax credits, the EV tax credits, and all these rebates for energy efficiency, but we left out the care economy. So we have a framework where health outcomes, for example, are treated not as the point of the matter, but are treated as a ancillary or a co-benefit to climate action. And if we were to understand this correctly, we would start perhaps from the fact that if it were its own country, the U.S. healthcare system would be the 13th largest carbon emitter on the planet. We would start from the fact that perhaps, if we invested in universal health coverage, that would make it possible for us to pursue actions and adaptations to climate change, because we would have much more stable communities, more stable households, people wouldn't be in debt, and so our society would be in a much better place. And so as environmentalists, we have to understand the value and the priority of social investments and the care economy as central to our actions and to our success on climate change and on environmental justice. And just from the just thinking about it from an environmental justice perspective, much of what we do in environmental justice work is trying to show and improve the evidence base that these communities are overburdened with pollution and their health is actually harmed by this pollution. But these communities are also those that are least likely to have access to the health care that would give us the evidence to show that they are overly burdened by this pollution. And so we have to be advocates for health access, for health equity, and for a much more robust health system if we want to improve environmental health through our advocacy. And I'll stop there in my 5 minutes.
Perfect timings. I was just standing up. Thank you, Khalil. And we'll turn to Kate Johnson.
Good. Thanks so much. On button. There we go. Thanks so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm Kate Johnson. I am with an organization called C40 Cities. For those of you who don't know us, we're a network of nearly 100 mayors around the world that work together to act ambitiously to confront the climate crisis. So as an organization, we are obviously very excited about the Inflation Reduction Act and the investment that could be made in cities. But I think, as was said in the previous panel, we also recognize that all of the benefits are not a foregone conclusion. And I think that's where cities and local governments are going to play a really critical role in realizing not only the emissions reduction benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act, but critically some of the equity benefits that we've talked about already. And I think it is going to require cities to play a role beyond the one that they are usually playing in terms of thinking about federal funding. So just to start, the Inflation Reduction Act, is going to direct funding to a lot of different entities. So I think what's different about this opportunity and how cities are approaching it is that they may not be the direct recipients, or they may not be competing directly for grants, but it's just thinking about the amount of investment that's going to be going into climate and clean energy solutions, much of which will be happening in their cities. And so as a mayor, as a local government leader, what role can you play? Just in terms of dollar amounts, the analysis that we've done, we found about $47 billion in the bill that could go directly to local governments, but that's really dwarfed when you look at the amount of funding that could be available through the tax credits, for example, which are on the order of closer to $300 billion or even more, as someone cited the recent Credit Suisse study. So we're really encouraging the cities that we work with to think beyond just that traditional model of cities applying for competitive grant fundings to do the things that they want to do. So to that end, we're putting out a guidebook at the end of the month for mayors and for cities. And lucky you, I will give you a little bit of preview of some of the roles that we are going to lay out in that guidebook that we're really encouraging cities to take. But I think, and these are guided by the fact that cities really do have a unique role to play here. They are the unit of government that is closest to people and to communities. They're connected to their residents and their businesses in a way that you just can't be at the state and federal level. And I think really critically, to Khalil's point about the environmental movement, you've seen a parallel effort happen within cities related to climate action and equity, and cities being very intentional about incorporating equity into their climate action plans and really trying to do some of the community-led planning that is now going to be resourced through the Inflation Reduction Act. And so with kind of that framing in mind, the key roles that we really envision for cities are one, to apply for that funding, noting that there's a huge barrier to entry to applying for federal grants. There's a lot of researchers here who I think share a similar experience to local governments, and just the, going through the process of applying for and then managing federal grants is not easy. And so there's a lot of energy going towards how can we help especially smaller communities access that funding. Another role that we think is really critical, and Khalil touched on some of the need for this, is the role for local governments to protect their frontline communities. So we haven't talked a lot about some of the challenges with the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's not perfect. And there are elements of the bill that could lead to, things in frontline communities that many cities and many of communities have been fighting against. And so we want mayors and local governments to see themselves as playing that critical role of protecting those communities. We want them to support and partner with their community-based organizations. One really exciting piece of the Inflation Reduction Act is that there will be funding directly available to community organizations. So they won't have to go through necessarily a state or a local government, but they're gonna need support in actually, putting together applications and accessing that funding. And we think local governments have a role to play there. They can assist their residents and their businesses access all of those tax credits. I've been in the clean energy climate space for a long time, and I still couldn't tell you how to access all of the tax credits that are now eligible, that I might be eligible for, that we all might be. So there's definitely a need for on-the-ground education in that space. Local governments can also help streamline getting the things we want to see built. So I think there's been a lot of progress across local governments in streamlining, for example, permitting solar on rooftops. But there's a lot of work to do. And given the level of funding and the acceleration that's about to happen as that money starts flowing, there's going to be a need to really ramp up those efforts at the local level to get the things built. And I think that includes some of the transmission lines too that you were mentioning. And then finally, cities are really well equipped at playing a coordination role and engaging partners in their communities and in their regions to put forth big ideas. And so I think it was said in the last panel that this is an opportunity to go big. And I think cities can really play that role in bringing partners to the table to put those big ideas out there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. And certainly not least, but unfortunately last year, is Bill Dietz.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm Bill Dietz. I'm the chair of the Redstone Global Center for Prevention and Wellness. I've been here 7 years, and when I came to this center, we decided that our task was to make DC the healthiest capital in the world. And over time, that shifted to focus on climate change. And I'll tell you that story in a moment. But I think it's important to recognize just what a unique and important moral responsibility we have. We are the second largest generator of greenhouse gases in the world. We are fourth among per capita producers of greenhouse gases, next to Brazil, China, and India. And that gives us a moral obligation to start here with respect to generation or reducing the generation of greenhouse gases. I'm a newbie to this field. My experience began in 2019 when I co-chaired the Lancet Commission on obesity and published a paper in the Lancet on the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. A syndemic, and we called climate change a pandemic. A syndemic is an interaction of two or more pandemics which interact in time and space and have an adverse impact on each other and a disproportionate impact on underserved populations. And the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change addresses just that. The inequities that are a result of the syndemic affect the global south primarily, but increasingly the US, secondary to catastrophic weather events. So that, for example, increased greenhouse gases reduce crop yields and change the micronutrient content of crops. And that's as important globally as it is locally. When you view this situation as a syndemic, it begins to point to what we've called triple duty solutions that affect both public and planetary health. So that, for example, climate change affects obesity and other chronic diseases, and as well as food and nutrition insecurity. So 2 examples, one on the food side and one on the transport side. So decreased beef consumption will decrease greenhouse gases and its effect on crop yields. And at the same time, that reduction in beef consumption will reduce cardiovascular disease, colon cancer, and obesity. The syndemic is climate change, health, and food security is the result. On the transport side, the support of active transport like walking, cycling, or the use of public transport will also decrease greenhouse gases and increase physical activity with decreased car use will not only decrease particulate pollution, but it will also decrease obesity and other chronic diseases. Again, an impact on climate change, health, and food security. You've heard a lot about these high-level policies, which I would label large P policies, those that affect at the national level. But I think we need to focus, and for those of you in this room who are thinking about what we can do, we need to focus on small P policies as well. These are within our control. And by small P policies, I mean those policies that affect cities and municipalities and also our own institutions. And that's work that we've begun at the Redstone Center. And I've been fortunate to have with us Kelly Whittier, who's taking pictures over here as a communications person, and Rachel Clark, who's our policy director, both of whom came out of Mary Che's office in Counsel, and have given us really a unique platform on which we can begin to influence policy. So our role here has been to focus on what we can do locally in terms of implementing the kinds of initiatives that you've mentioned. So on the food side, Rachel and Kelly generated an issue brief related to the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration. This addresses four main targets in the district. Increased awareness of the importance of climate change and reductions in greenhouse gases, reductions in food waste, which generate 8% of greenhouse gases. And I should have mentioned that the reason for our focus on nutrition and physical activity is that 10% of greenhouse gases in the United States are generated by the agricultural sector. 85% of those gases are methane. On the fossil fuel side, 30% of greenhouse gases in the United States come from fossil fuels. Half of that is related to car transport. And 8%, as I mentioned, of greenhouse gas generations come from food waste. So the Glasgow Food Policy Brief focuses on increased awareness, reductions in food waste, reductions in meat consumption, and building resiliency through the development of a central food processing facility. One of the most immediate actions was support of the Green Food Purchasing Amendment Act, which calls for a 25% decrease in greenhouse gases generated by food purchases in the district by 2030. And so our testimony has been in support of both the Green Food Purchasing Amendment Act and the importance of the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration. Another good example of our engagement in the district is that Rachel is a member of the DC Food Policy Council, which can begin to implement some of these issues. On the transport side, we've focused on transportation policy and active transport, bicycling, on pedestrian use and active transport, which will directly address some of the inequities because Ward 7 and 8 have an increased risk of traffic fatalities, increased exposure to air pollutants, which contributes to chronic diseases, and those things contribute to decreased physical activity, increases in obesity and chronic diseases. The benefits of active transport exceed the potential benefits of fuel-efficient cars and increase the costs of parking. Safe routes to school is another strategy here that increases physical activity, and traffic safety legislation is essential to promote walking and biking. And I'd just like to close with one comment because I mentioned earlier that the small P policies not only affect what we do here in the district, but also affect what we do here in our institution, in the School of Public Health, and more generally, George Washington University. So the Sunrise movement at George Washington University is focusing on fossil fuel research. And this is an issue that's going to come before the faculty here in our faculty meeting shortly for consideration of approval. And Lynn has begun to actively engage in food procurement standards that include greenhouse gas emissions or sustainability for vending and events. So those of you who are looking for things to do, don't look any further than right here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill, and thank you to all of our panelists. As those of you who work with me know, I am never short on questions, and so I have many, but I would also like to invite anyone who has a question to please come forward to the mic right here. Or if you're watching on the live stream, feel free to chat it, I believe is the method we're using, and somebody will verbalize it here. So just to kick us off, though, a lot of you talked about different sectors and different administrative scales of actions. We've talked about transportation, we've talked about energy, we've talked about land management, we've talked about agriculture and diet, and we've also talked about the local scale, city, state, all the way up to federal and international too. What is the role of health and equity and environmental justice at these various scales, and can it help to accelerate action towards deep decarbonization? And maybe I'll start here with you, Kalu.
And no surprise, I think it's central. I think it's central to both how we organize around the question. I think it's central to how we develop the political will to act. And I think it's central to actually having a holistic solution. It's because too often we think about how do we transition systems, the energy grid, our transportation system. But what we're really talking about is how do we transition people from a reliance on fossil fuels to one where they are able to have and to sustain a quality of life without setting the atmosphere on fire. And part of that has to be about how do we secure their livelihoods, how do we secure their health, education, nutrition, through doing that. And so investments in what are the social dimensions of climate change are critical to us being successful in acting on climate change. And as the environmental movement, we've been quiet. We're not comfortable in that space, but we have to do more if we're going to have an equitable transition to climate change. It's key to making climate action equitable.
If I can take that maybe from a slightly different perspective, which is I think we've seen quite a few of our mayors really center health and justice in their climate initiatives, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the politically rewarding thing to do. So one example, not from the US, but that I would use is in London, our current chair of C40 is Mayor Sadiq Khan, and he has been able to expand the ultra-low emission zone in London, which is, some of you may know it by the term of congestion pricing, so not something that you typically think of as being all that popular, but he's really centered the very local benefits to health of reducing air pollution in making the case for that pretty bold solution. And I think that why that works is because sometimes climate investments feel like a down payment on something in the future, but if you can point to the very immediate health benefits of doing that work, you can build a coalition and get bigger things done. And it's the right thing to do, but we've also found that it can help unstick some things politically as well, especially in cities.
Just to underscore that, we worked with C40 cities to analyze their climate action plans that each city wrote over the past few years. And this is work that Katie O'Donnell there in the back, who's their program coordinator at the Climate and Health Institute and helping to organize this event, was instrumental in. And we found that every single city wrote about health and equity in their climate action plans. So very consistent with what you just said. Bill or Rob?
Yeah, I don't think we mentioned that we're a C40 city here in DC. Did we? I don't think so. What an omission. So I want to just give one example. So one of the major findings here in the district is the existence of heat islands, particularly in Ward 7 and 8, which lead to heat events and heat-related illness. It also leads to decreased physical activity. And one of the potential solutions is parks. Parks are a carbon capture solution, and we know that the availability of parks increases physical activity and would reduce these heat islands, particularly in a neighborhood which is in desperate need of those. The other effect of that, the increase in physical activity, will reduce chronic diseases and reduce the high healthcare cost. And we know that in Ward 7 and 8, that the highest, in the district, it's the highest prevalence of inactivity, the highest prevalence of cardiovascular disease, and the highest prevalence of obesity. So this is a triple duty solution, a park.
Rob, any thoughts from you?
Sure, I'll talk about both EPA and the land management agencies. So EPA is authorized to administer a whole raft of statutes, some of which are not primarily oriented toward public health protection, but the Clean Air Act is. So, for example, when EPA is thinking about regulating emissions of any pollutant, including greenhouse gases from motor vehicles, it's supposed to assess whether or not the pollutants can reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health. The same test applies to efforts to regulate pollutants, including greenhouse gases from industrial sources or electric power plants. And in terms of the co-pollutants that accompany emissions of greenhouse gases when fossil fuels are burned, particulate matter, oxides of nitrogen, sulfur dioxide. The standard that governs those is that EPA is supposed to issue controls or standards that are requisite to protect the public health, that is good enough to protect the public health. So EPA is all about public health protection. That's really its primary mission. That's not the case with the land management agencies, whose primary mission is really ecosystem management, not public health protection. But certainly what the land management agencies do can have a dramatic impact, for better or for worse, on the public health. And so if the Forest Service and the BLM start issuing many new oil and gas leases on public lands, it's going to generate greenhouse gases. They're going to have the kind of adverse effects in public health that we heard many of our speakers talk about today. If it instead moves toward displacing greenhouse gases with clean energy, then it's going to have the opposite effect. And the inquiries that the agencies are required to do can be quite sweeping. And I'll give you an example under the National Environmental Policy Act. So suppose that the Forest Service or the BLM is thinking about issuing a certificate that would approve the construction of a new natural gas pipeline. So it's got to consider the environmental impacts of engaging in that action under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Courts have said it's not enough to consider the immediate impacts on the environment of the construction of the pipeline itself. You have to think about the indirect effects upstream on incentives to create or extract new natural gas, which can now be carried through the pipeline. And you have to think about the impacts downstream on the increased consumption of natural gas that will be carried through the pipeline. So even though public health protection is not a core component of what the land management agencies do, what they do certainly directly and indirectly can have a significant impact on public health. Now, in terms of environmental justice, President Clinton issued an environmental justice order, which I think by consensus really didn't change the way the federal government operates. The Biden administration is trying to do more, and I think the Inflation Reduction Act will assist it in doing so.
Thank you. Jerry.
Jerry Paulson. If I can ask you to perhaps expand your concept of land management agencies. One of the biggest agencies in the federal government is the Department of Defense. And they certainly control a heck of a lot of acres of U.S. land and control, what goes on in and on those acres. And can you maybe think a little bit out loud about the Department of Defense and its land management opportunities for improving the climate change situation?
I read a figure the other day that said that 70 to 80% of all federal emissions of greenhouse gases come from the defense agencies. So they are an enormous part of the problem when it comes to the federal government's contribution. So what can be done about that? I'll give you a down and an upside. The downside is that the courts in this country have been very solicitous of national defense agencies and the activities they want to engage in. And anytime you've got a clash between an environmental statute and national defense priorities, the former tend to be subordinated to the latter. The courts are very reluctant to do anything that could threaten national security as pitched to them by the Department of Defense and the other national defense agencies. And I'm not sure that that mindset is going to change very easily. The upside is that GW's law school has historically had a high number of LLM students from the U.S. military, and particularly from the Air Force. And the students who come to GW and study under me and my colleagues are all about improving the environmental footprint of the Department of Defense and the national defense agencies. And they write papers, and they go back to their agencies, and they say, here's what I learned about what we're doing and how it could potentially affect the environment, and we need to do a better job. And I'm convinced that they're going to make their mark, and are already starting to do that.
Great. Oh, sorry, Cliff, go ahead.
I would say, and this is my answer is not directly tied to the Department of Defense, but I would classify it as what we would call a hard to decarbonize sector, because you're not going to electrify a Bradley fighting vehicle or Abrams tank anytime soon. And so the issue with those, think about steel and concrete manufacturing or other hard to decarbonize sectors. And so, within the IRA, and this was a huge source of contention between some of the environmental community and the environmental justice community, who deal with the local pollutants and health impacts of these sectors. But within the IRA, are investment resources for carbon capture and storage, for example, so that you can produce hydrogen and other types of fuels that could be used, in some of these sectors, but capturing the carbon, at least at the site of production. And again, this doesn't necessarily answer to the defense industry, but just as a hard to decarbonize sector, this is something that is being discussed. But the other, land management agency, I would say that we need to mention is HUD. And so from the environmental justice and the environmental health perspective, HUD has a potentially very important role. And some of you may have seen, may be familiar with, a couple of months ago, HUD issued a ruling against a metal shredder in Chicago that wanted to move from the north side, I believe, of the city. It's a much more affluent, majority white part of the town to, I think, either in the south or the west. Which was lower income and community of color. And HUD intervened and used its authority over zoning, which they've been reluctant to tell cities how to apply their own zoning laws in this way. But for EJ communities who are overly burdened by these industries, no matter what they are, for them, it's a question of zoning and why are they, so heavily targeted by these industries. And there's a role and a potential relationship between HUD's authority on zoning and the EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act and mandatory emissions reductions and cumulative impact assessments that we can hopefully learn to deploy much more completely to protect these communities. And even as we're trying to figure out these nuance and these new technologies to decarbonize these hard to decarbonize sectors, that we're also still thinking about, okay, but how do we reduce the burden of these sectors on these targeted communities? And so zoning as a land management strategy is going to be huge.
Great. We have one last question. Let's make this the last one.
I'd like to hear your thoughts in, I think, two contrasting concepts that are especially taught in public health schools. So on the one hand, there seems to be this unified voice around how single-payer systems, single policy systems, as advocates for climate equity, for health equity, are the way to go. On the other hand, there is now a loss of morale after a slew of court decisions, NFIB on the Obamacare, the Dobbs decision for abortion, and now West Virginia essentially undoing Chevron, that there's this persistent non-delegation that is withdrawing federal's ability to set that national policy standard. What does it mean to have a unified standard in health, in equity, in climate, given these two very contrasting knowledge bases of supposed experts around the country?
Wow.
I'm just the moderator. You got to take the tough questions. Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Well, I would just say don't lose hope. I mean, that drives us all. We can't give up just because of the rulings we're facing. I mean, it's depressing, admittedly, and frustrating. But if we lose hope, we lose the initiative. Mm-hmm. And I think, as I said, I think that there are lots of these issues at the federal level that we can bypass by engagement at the state and local level. That's not as powerful as the kind of large P policies that would affect climate change, mm-hmm. but it's something we can do.
Yeah.
I would add a point. I mean, I think those court decisions are not coming from democratically elected officials who reflect the view of any electorate anywhere. I think that they are coming from appointed officials that in turn were identified to serve on the court by people who are in a certain kind of political point of view that, you know, and with a certain mission, if you made it take down a lot of these health standards. Yep. But I do not believe that the people of this country have voiced that they support these kinds of decisions, including Dobbs. And now we have to go through the process of getting these issues worked back through our legitimately elected representatives to reverse some of these things. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take time. Some of it's going to happen locally or at a state level, but that's what's going to have to happen. Because the court is going to be in the hands of these judges for a very long time.
Yep.
I think it's been said, but it might be worth saying again, that the Supreme Court has not constrained the ability of state and local governments to address these issues, and obviously there are limitations. I might not call them small p policies. I think they're pretty big Ps, and I think that's what it's going to take is that hard work of organizing, you know, zoning commissions, public utility commissions, city councils, mayors, you know, all the way on up. And there's a lot of hope there, I guess, is what I would say.
Okay, final comments, Khalil, and then Rob.
Yeah, I would just add to that, you know, two things. One, you know, we have an opportunity, I think, now to, you know, rethink politics, you know, with the resources that are available to us, which you know aren't the end of the world. You know, they aren't the end all be all. They're not going to solve everything. But so, you know, we're having again, you know, this discussion, you know, within our office. You know, about, you know, much of the environmental movement. We don't do a whole lot of work in the Southeast because we just figure, you know, from our campaign perspective, we can't win legislatively in any state house in the Southeast, so why bother going there? You know, but my argument is, well, and especially now that we have the resources, is, well, no, we can use community development as a progressive political strategy, and we can transform the dynamics there. You know, I want to take these resources and I want to invest as heavily as we can into a certain senator from West Virginia's district and really show proof of case, like this is what can happen if you support the right types of policy, right? And so I want to use that as an organizing tool to say, how are we implementing climate justice? How are we implementing environmental justice, you know, through these resources and making sure that we are maximizing the benefits and the outcomes of these resources to the extent possible, and using that as a leverage point, using it as an organizing tool, and you know, we have to, you know, flip and maintain, you know, the Congress and look forward, because the Supreme Court isn't going anywhere, but there are going to be other opportunities. We're also talking to, in this building, Dr. Wendy Ellis, who is working on pulling together a coalition to really challenge, you know, the GOP and to really challenge, you know, the right to lifers, you know, in the wake of the Roe v. Wade decision about, okay, how are you supporting life? So let's really support life through the types of policies that will support life, that will support the right livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods for people going forward. And I'm really trying to work with her because I really want the environmental movement to be a part of that coalition, because I think, one, we have a lot to add to it, but also a lot to learn. And I think that message is really what can help us win the day. And what's going to be necessary to win the day, you know, for successful climate action is how do we actually supporting quality of life.
Briefly, Rob.
Federal law does carve out a role for state leadership on environmental efforts. And a good example is the Clean Air Act, which authorizes California to apply to EPA for permission to adopt emission standards on new cars and trucks that are more stringent than EPA's. And if EPA approves that request, any other state in the country can piggyback onto California's standards and adopt them for their jurisdictions. Trump administration tried to eliminate that authority, but the Biden administration has restored it. And in terms of the power of individuals to contest and combat court decisions they don't agree with, within the last few months, the voters of Kansas overturned an attempt to basically ban all abortions in the state. I lived and taught law in Kansas for 27 years. It's a very, very red state. I was really surprised by this result, and so don't give up hope.
Great note to end on. Thank you so much. And just thank you to all of our amazing panelists. Of course, the toughest and most interesting questions always come at the end, so sorry to have to cut off that conversation, but wanted to extend my deep gratitude and thanks to Dean Goldman for having the idea for this event in the first place. Thank you. And Katie O'Donnell in the back there making things happen, and Aaron Phillips, Kelly Whittier for taking pictures, Bij and Kalena and Daniel for helping to coordinate all of us, and all of the faculty, staff, and students at the Climate and Health Institute, as well as Senator Carper's staff and the GW President, Mark Wrighton staff as well. Thank you, and of course, to all of our panelists on both panels for sharing your insights and wisdom. We do have a reception, which will be right out here, so I hope you can all stay. And for those of you on the live stream, thank you so much for tuning in, and please feel free to reach out to any of us. And thank you all.
You want us to get it for pictures? Yeah. I figured that's why you. Hello.